of both the Education Policy Program and the Federal Education Budget Project. Very pleased that everyone's here today. My history is as a Capitol Hill aide handling education finance issues. And during that time, there was a great deal of frustration on the Hill that there wasn't an independent, nonpartisan entity out there to provide non-biased, comprehensive, reliable information on the federal education budget, federal education funding. That's sort of spin-free, but also gives you a good indication of the real-world impact of many of our education funding decisions that are so important in schools and districts around the country. So we've tried to create it here at the New America Foundation. If you go to our website, edbudgetproject.org, there's a treasure trove of information for everyone who could possibly be interested, I think, in education funding, from parents and teachers to advocates to folks on Capitol Hill to researchers. I'm going to run very briefly through some of those resources, and then we'll get to our panel discussion. I decided to start with this first instead of the panel because our panel's so great. After they speak, you're all going to leave happy. If you go to edbudgetproject.org, you'll quickly come on our main homepage, and we've got a series of resources here. We have data analysis for every school district in the country, funding, demographic, achievement information. You could type in a school district, your home school district, no matter how big or small, and up will pop a thumbnail sketch of federal education funding that goes to that district. We have national rankings of how the states compare on per pupil expenditure, student achievement, poverty data, and school finance equity with analysis for each. We also have resource pages on a variety of areas that sometimes get a lot of debate, but not always a lot of light and truth. Is No Child Left Behind underfunded or not? How underfunded is it? How is IDEA an unfunded mandate or not? What impact does it have on local school districts? The Department of Education is going to be running an auction program for $10 billion worth of student loans each year. How is that going to work? We have all sorts of basic resources here. And then finally, we also put together sort of more in-depth policy papers. I mentioned there are state rankings. This is a color-coded map of rankings of per pupil expenditure, with the dark states being the low-spending states, which, as you can see, is the South and West, which also is where the highest poverty is and the lowest achievement. I mentioned you could look at an individual school district. This is Birmingham, Alabama. We've got what Birmingham spends in per pupil expenditure, how it ranks in the state, the size of its budget, and federal funding. People think that the federal role in education is very small, on average maybe 8%. Some school districts it's very large because they are high poverty school districts. And for example, in Birmingham, Alabama, 10% of their budget comes from just the federal Title I program and IDEA program. That comprises about 2/3 of federal K-12 funding. So they're way over 10% when it comes to the share of federal funding that they have that's derived from the federal government. Likewise, for every school district in the country, we have how much they received in Title I funding. In past years, this coming year, we have the earliest projection for every district in the country, and the projection under the Bush budget. We also have something that doesn't appear anywhere else, which is IDEA funding by school district. No one else has this. We had to contact all 50 states. We had to FOIA a couple of states because they weren't happy in giving us this information. We'll have school lunch data for every district as well. We also have achievement data for every district. So again, Birmingham City, Alabama. You can see that the state average NCLB score, 83% proficiency in reading. In Birmingham, it's about 70%. But of course, Alabama, like most states, lies when they say how good their students are doing, and because they have either weak state standards or associated weak tests. So we've taken a look at how the state does on the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, to find out a better indication of what the real level of proficiency is. As you can see in Alabama, they say that 83% of their fourth graders are proficient in reading, but on the NAEP, only 22% are proficient in reading. So if you know that Birmingham is at about 70% on the state NAEP test, that means that Birmingham is somewhere around 20% or less on the NAEP. 4 out of 5 kids in the city of Birmingham, Alabama are not proficient in reading according to the standards that are reflected in the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And in the future, This is just sort of the 1.0 version of the education budget project. In the future, we'll have this broken down by demographic group, and also we'll have information on schools making AYP, adequate yearly progress, under No Child Left Behind. I mentioned that there are resource pages. There are 12 different tax benefits, for example, in higher education, because we need 12. And they all have different eligibility rules, different funding amounts. So if you want a thumbnail sketch on that, you can go to one of these resource pages on the side. And then lastly, for the sort of budgeteers, penultimate, for the budgeteers, there's more in-depth information, the sort of obscure topic of advance appropriations. How does it work? Why is it important? Why is it good or bad? So you can get these in-depth policy papers. And then lastly, New America is, I hope, known somewhat for our policy blogs. Probably the most famous one is higheredwatch.org. Higheredwatch.org broke the student loan scandal in 2007, where we found out that financial aid officers were getting kickbacks or stock options to steer students the way of favored banks. Well, we've created other blogs as well. Ed Money Watch, which focuses in on school finance matters. Early Ed Watch, if you're interested in early education. Or if you're a generalist, you can just go to edpolicywatch.org, and you'll get content every day with news, analysis, and commentary in the world of education. Our goal is to try and bridge the gap between policy and politics and academia, but also between policymakers, political interests, and the media, because often the media is not getting very good information when it comes to education funding, which means the public isn't getting very good information when it comes to education funding. The purpose of today's event, and for that matter, the Federal Education Budget Project as a whole, is to shed light on this process, take a behind-the-scenes look at the process and the politics behind the federal budget and federal education funding. We are very pleased to have a distinguished panel with us. I'm going to invite them up. We'll get rid of this PowerPoint for what I hope will be what I expect will be a very good and engaging conversation. Why don't you guys come on up? I'll introduce you as you make your way up. Thanks. Just one note before our panelists begin, and I begin introductions. I want to thank our staff here at the New America Foundation for putting together the Federal Education Budget Project. If you go to edbudgetproject.org, you can download all the raw data to do your own research and analysis. You get a spreadsheet with every district in the country, their demographics are, their federal funding level, their achievement, over 1 million data points. Soumya Bhatt with our staff, Justin King, Lindsay Lupko, Ben Miller, Heather Riemann, Jason Delisle, Sarah Mead, Troy Snyder, and Mike Jones. These are the people who have, over more than a year and a half, put all this information together in one place so that folks can access data that they may not otherwise get, and also start to make connections on policy and political matters that they may not have made before. Let me briefly speak to our speakers. Our order is going to be Dave Rowe from the Office of Management and Budget. Dave is the chief of the education branch. OMB is the most powerful agency in Washington that no one seems to know about. And hopefully Dave, who is a young man but has risen relatively quickly and now has, I guess, a good number of years experience, 10 years at OMB, can give us an inside look as to just how OMB operates in putting together the president's budget, the relations between agencies and the White House for that matter. Following Dave, since once OMB puts out its budget on the first Tuesday of every February? Monday of every February, will be Ellen Murray. Ellen is the majority clerk, or what I like to call staff director, even though she doesn't want to, of the Labor Age Education Appropriations Subcommittee. This is the subcommittee chaired by Senator Harkin, formerly chaired by Senator Specter, that divvies up almost all social service discretionary funding each year, healthcare, education, and labor. So the people who have to make the awful decisions about, do you fund special education and do you fund the Center for Disease Control, and how do you choose? We're followed by, next will be Tom Skelly, who's been at the Department of Education for some 30 years. He has unparalleled knowledge of the budget process. He's the director of the budget service at the Department of Education. He helps put together and has the unenviable task every year on the first Tuesday, following the first Monday of every February, of defending the president's budget, which no one is ever happy with, regardless of what administration there is, because it's not enough. Tom will give us some insights on budgets and administration transition years, which obviously we're coming up upon. And then we're going to end with Bob Greenstein, who is a member of our advisory panel and is the founder of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, which is, frankly, a model that the Little Federal Education Budget Project aspires to be half of in 20 years. They are the single most influential group on budget and finance matters in Washington, respected on all sides despite a very clear liberal bent. Their research is considered of unparalleled rigor and credibility, and we look forward to his comments on the big budget picture, short and long term. Dave, why don't we start with you? I assume you want to sit, and then we'll have maybe 10 minutes per speaker. Okay?
Sounds good.
Great. Turn the mic close.
Can people hear me like this, or does this help? All right. Just a couple quick disclaimers. One, I'm speaking kind of on, from the perspective of a sort of an OMB career staffer who's been there for about 11 years, and sort of the perspective that I see, which is a good perspective cutting across 2 administrations, soon to be 3. But there's obviously sort of other perspectives within OMB. 2, and more importantly, what I'm going to try to cover in 10 minutes. There's whole day-long courses or books or 2 or 3 hour presentations I've done on that. So I'm going to only try to sort of focus on the key areas to try to get to sort of the key question of how do we get to a $59.2 billion increase or budget for the Department of Education in 2009. Where do we even start? Basically, or the big piece is, as Michael said, the budget comes out in February. Starting on what that budget looks like begins the summer before. And it's both a top-down and bottom-up process, and the fall and the winter is where the executive branch is trying to make those 2 fit. Bottom-up, I mean by in September, we receive from the Department of Education, and other agencies provide to OMB2, their request for the budget, what Secretary Spellings was looking for the budget for that upcoming fiscal year. Top down, what OMB is doing at the same time we get that detailed request is, we're developing a framework for the budget that's being prepared. Now, what does that mean? What that means is in the summer, early fall, OMB is developing kind of a big picture analysis of the federal budget situation, looking at the economic projections, revenue estimates, how much different programs are going to cost under current law, and where discretionary spending is probably going to end up that year. Now, based on that, OMB works with the White House and its sort of up and down, its senior White House officials, including sort of often the president, on defining both kind of what's possible in that budget and begin to formulate the broad policy goals and sort of principles that are going to define what the administration is going to do that year. Now, what does that mean? It includes, balanced budget targets, for instance. In the last couple of years, sort of the framework we've been working under to develop the 2008 and 2009 budgets was, reaching a balanced budget by 2012. In the Clinton administration, we were in similar situations where I think it was 99 or 2000 where sort of there was a realization that they could hit balance in that year, and there was sort of the framework we were working under and the numbers we were working under was to try to ensure that we hit balance in, I think it was 99 or 2000. Broad significant policy goals. If there's, sort of initial planning up front, if the administration wants to aim for broad entitlement reforms or significant expansions of big dollar programs. And then 3, sort of in what's most relevant to most of education's budget is, how large is the discretionary spending piece of the pie going to be in that upcoming year? This is the amount that the appropriations, that where money is appropriated each year as opposed to being an entitlement. Now, through the 90s, that process was pretty easy on setting the total discretionary levels because they were set in law. There was sort of balanced budget agreements that Congress and the administration had worked together to set that. Now there's no target set in law, so it's kind of the administration is sort of needing to set that level each year. And It's over the last couple of years. It's no secret in the budget, the Bush administration has been trying to restrain growth in some areas of discretionary spending and in discretionary spending overall, and that's kind of the framework we work under. So how that level gets set, very briefly, is OMB is looking at sort of simultaneously looking at sort of policy questions and issues about how much overall spending should increase. The 2009 budget had a couple concrete goals on the discretionary side where, discretionary spending shouldn't increase any more than GDP, and non-defense, non-security spending, taking out defense, homeland, and so on, that should increase by less than 1%. Now, the bones of that framework were sort of developed in the fall, and then we're driving a lot of the policy decisions that we're going forward later on through the year. So that question was placed. Spending plans and assumptions for large categories and programs, looking at sort of what are sort of the plans already for for defense spending and homeland spending. OMB is looking at sort of places where we know we need to protect spending in that upcoming budget based on places where we know costs are going to increase significantly, fulfilling past commitments. If there is a goal to double NIH funding, we're going to make sure up front that we're building into our numbers that we're working on a capacity to do that. Money for spending spending increases associated with No Child Left Behind reauthorization and so on. Also, what we try to do early on is sort of set aside money for unforeseen sort of contingencies that we don't know how much things are going to cost until later in the year. Pell Grants is a perfect example in education where the reality is we don't know until December, once we get new data on enrollment and economic conditions, whether costs are going to be, they'll be $1 billion higher or lower than what we would have estimated in the fall. And we try to plan for emergencies like that. And then sort of implications on the rest. And we try to use that base to essentially from that macro analysis, we end up getting a directed to say, we know education came in with X. We want to see, an OMB director wants to see the policies and choices involved with, say, cutting spending by 5% or a straight line. And it's sort of the framework that we're given to then, try to fit within the macro total that the budget's trying to hit. And that's essentially where the interplay between agencies, between OMB and the agencies happen on the budget, where essentially what we're trying to do is macro level, take everything that the administration wants to do and the political appointees across the administration want to do, and prioritize those ideas and make it fit within the macro total, and then B, resolve differences within the administration. And I can't do justice to the process, but essentially, we take kind of an education budget based on the rough targets we're given. We either smooth out the edges or frankly make them rougher based on what OMB wants to, based on OMB political appointees' decisions, pass that back to the Department of Education. And the way to think about the budget process, especially once education and agencies receive our cut of what they gave of their request, is a major negotiation process. And it's a negotiation process across a $3 trillion budget in the federal government. It's both high level and low level. It's literally conversations between the director of OMB and the Secretary of Education, with the director of OMB saying, well, I can give you $500 million, but I can't give you $600 million, and I can't give you the IDEA increase that you're looking for, as well as sort of smaller level items to try to close out issues. It might be Tom Skelly and I working on $5, $10, $15 million, which in the federal budget picture is rounding errors on salaries and expenses funding or some small level items. That's as much justice as I can give in sort of this capacity, but it's, if you can imagine, sort of a major negotiation process between OMB and the agencies to make all the budget numbers fit. The White House plays a sort of a significant role in that process too, on a few different places. One, obviously, in the White House, to take a step back, has lots of policy councils, domestic policy council, national economic council, basically teams of advisors that directly advise the president and try to coordinate the policy process within the administration. And there's sort of two main roles. One, they opine on sort of what where they want to see funding within particular agencies, and whether they agree with Secretary Spellings on what she's looking for Title I or Pell Grants or whatever. Two, and the more interesting role is across whoever the administration is, the White House is often running sort of its own policy process on trying to develop sort of State of the Union highlights, sort of other kind of front and center budget proposals that are usually not the big ticket items, which we've been talked about a few months ago, but are kind of more the presidential initiatives that are often sort of cut across several different agencies or are part of an overall message. There's a few kind of different categories here, a few different ways to think about this. The American Competitiveness Initiative is one good example from the last couple of years in the Bush administration, where they were, where it's R&D funding and education funding related to, to increase America's competitiveness. It's sometimes, very small, discrete budget proposals that are, in this administration, student drug testing. There was a State of the Union announcement back in 2005 related to a student drug testing initiative that sort of culminated into a budget proposal. The Clinton administration literally had dozens of these sort of small items that were developed as part of the kind of the White House policy process that fed into the macro budget process. It varies, frankly, from administration to administration, year to year, how much this is meshed together between, how aligned that is with kind of the core budget process that OMB runs with different agencies. Rollout, I'm not going to go into as much detail as much as to say it's very methodically planned on how the administration hints at what's going to be in the budget in the State of the Union, highlights some major proposals before the main budget comes out in February, often including a lot of these sort of White House developed policy initiatives. And then, how rollout happens the day the budget comes out, where it's done at the macro level at OMB and the very detailed level at the Department of Education. We often know what's going to get attention and what's not, and what's going to be controversial and what's going to be praised. The reality is there's always surprises. One example I can think of in education was, when the 2006 budget rolled out, we knew that the Pell Grant increase was going to be significant. We knew some of the other increases in the budget were going to be significant, and the cuts were going to be controversial. What I wasn't anticipating was a Washington Post editorial on student loan tables buried in page 371 of the budget appendix. So there's a lot of kind of, wild cards that you're not necessarily anticipating that the administration's always dealing with when they're rolling out the budget. In terms of challenges, very, very quickly, a couple things that made this process a little messier is, one, late appropriations bills. Usually we don't know what last year's funding is until late December, if not later, which makes it very difficult to be building kind of what next year's budget's going to be. And two, OMB runs budget policy, Treasury runs tax policy. They absolutely meet at the end, but I think the last two administrations, and my understanding is every administration has struggled with how do you kind of best or better look across budget policies and tax policies to have a sort of to make sure you're kind of really balancing trade-offs between the two, as opposed to just having them meet at the end and hope or try to ensure at the end sort of consistency. But again, there's hours more I could talk about this, but I'm going to not dominate the panel.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Dave. So the agency brings you their wish list to OMB. OMB passes back to the agency. It's cut. Then the agency goes and cries back to OMB and the White House and says, OMB stinks. Those bean counters give us more money. And then OMB eventually works it out with the White House and the agency.
Correct.
Out comes the budget on Monday of the first Monday in February. And it then is in the hands of Congress. Ellen Murray.
That's correct. I'm Ellen Murray, and I'm with the Labor Age Subcommittee, and we share David's frustration on the late appropriation bills because it's us putting them together over Christmas. So our New Year's Day is sort of that first Monday in February, as David mentions, when we get the budget. And our biggest question, of course, is what color is the cover? Because we have done an office pool on guessing that. We spend the first weekend summarizing the budget for our bosses. We spend the next week writing talking points. In recent years, as David's probably painfully aware, talking points complaining about the budget they sent us. It makes it easier when the administration proposes the same cuts because we can just use the same talking points with minor updates.
It's easier to build, too. Yeah.
The budget resolution is really the beginning of the process in Congress. That's really where the die is cast. It determines the amount of money that Congress is going to have available for the 12 appropriation bills and for many mandatory spending. That budget resolution may or may not be the same as the president's budget. Of course, with the current administration and the current Congress, the budget resolution has had more money for non-defense discretionary spending. That's not a surprise, and of course has been the cause of the big budget stalemates we've had in Washington. Under budget resolutions, anything spent by authorizers have to be paid for. You all remember last year, or now was it 2 years ago, Donica, that the Health Committee cut returns to lenders and was able to use the money to increase Pell Grants. They had to pay for it under PAYGO. The budget resolution also comes up with what is called the 302A allocation. That's the money that 12 appropriation subcommittees have to spend the money. The budget markup process is very frustrating to us appropriators. Budget committee members, other members of Congress, advocate to the Budget Committee for more money for their favorite project. The Budget Committee puts together this document and has various functions. 500 is education and training. The Budget Committee will say, this budget includes X increase for education, doubles Title I, does this, does that, does not mention. There's another function called 920 that's like an across-the-board cut. So members look at the budget resolution, they read it, and they say, this is great. The money I want for Title I, the money I want for NIH, the money I want for community health centers is included in here. There's enough money. Not the case. We try to make that point every year, but not very well. Both the House and the Senate passed the budget resolution in the last couple of weeks. It includes approximately $21 billion more than the president for non-defense discretionary spending. So that budget that was sent up in February, Congress looked at it, said, no, we're going to do $21 billion more. President said, fine. What, is that correct? No. The next step is that this 302A number, the number that the 12 subcommittees have, is given to the two chairmen of the Appropriations Committee, Mr. Obey in the House, Senator Byrd in the Senate. They then give each subcommittee what's called our 302B allocation. This is when we begin to whine, grovel, write committee reports, beg, and find out that Chuck Kiefer, due to his experience at OMB, is impervious to all our whining and groveling, and even baked goods by our staff assistant. We are then given our allocation. Allocations are formally given in the Senate when we do our first markup, which will be next Thursday, but we have all informally been given our allocation. This is how much money we have to put together the labor HHS bill, which is funding labor programs, health programs, and education programs. At first, it looks pretty good. We'll probably have $5 to $6 billion over last year. Sounds like a lot of money, and it is. But we sit down and immediately begin to work with our minority Senator Specter staff on a table. How are we going to put this money together? We've been meeting with outside interest groups for 6 months. We've been talking to members. We've been reading. We have read. The budget justifications that we get for all our committees probably would reach from this table to almost the ceiling. And we actually do look at those, read those. Tom's is the best. You asked me to say that.
It's a page turner.
Page turner. And we begin to allocate those. Well, we have about $6 billion, say, over last year. It's going to cost us $2.7 billion just to maintain the Pell Grant. That's not going to increase the maximum Pell any more than the across-the-board cut it last year. It's just because college costs are higher. You all know better than I do. More students are getting Pell. So 2.7 really doesn't increase Pell for any particular person, but it's cost. It's going to cost us about $1 billion just to increase administrative costs at CMS, which runs Medicare and Medicaid, and Social Security. Again, we can't ignore that. Medicare contractors process billions of Medicare claims. Social Security already has a huge backlog in processing disability. So we have to do that. If these agencies don't have this money, they're going to get further behind. We did not fund pandemic flu in our bill last year. The president has proposed approximately $500 million for pandemic flu activities. These are important. Senator Harkin and Specter started this initiative a few years ago. We need to be ready. The administration's doing a good job. We have to provide that money. So we are. So it ends up, after we take care of what I'd call these sort of mandatories, not mandatories in the sense we use it on the Hill, we have about, at most, $2 billion to give real increases. That's about 1.6% of our whole bill. Now, we're dealing with these members who think they got huge increases because of what was said in the budget resolution. This causes us a problem because Senator Y comes to us and said, you know, I'm so excited that you're going to be able to provide X dollars for this particular program. That particular number that he's expecting is greater than our total increase after we do these mandatories. So we do the best we can. We've read the budget justifications. We've met with a lot of you. We talk to our members. We have particularly long meetings with our subcommittee members. We work with Senator Kennedy's staff, who we have a great partnership with, and work closely with Senator Specter's staff. It's a great working relationship, which really makes it fun. We try to respect our Republican members as we do the Democratic members on our subcommittee as far as their priorities go. So we come up with a table. We talk to Senators Harkin and Specter. They unfortunately always have a few ideas of their own. We try to explain to them that we just don't have the money. And as they're wont to say, you can figure it out. We have a vote. We figure it out. We're still jiggering with the table. And finally, we have to start putting the bill and report together, which is what we're doing now. We're going to mark up on June 24th in subcommittee, June 26th in full committee. Putting the report together is a lot of hard work, and the bill, it's technical. We laugh that we get our first draft in, and then we get 100 emails with requests and clarifications and panic calls from the administration about this or that. And it ends up being 20-hour days, a lot of bad food, but we get it done. We mark up in subcommittee, which is usually pretty simple. We move on to full committee. Again, that opens it up to amendments. Frustration we have on our bill is amendments, since we do labor, health, and education, can be on a variety of matters, most of which have nothing to do with our bill. So we have come to learn to be very quick learners on a number of issues. The next step is the floor. Now, I don't know if we're going to go to the floor this year. I think, as you all know, the president has said that he will veto any bills that are over his numbers. These bills will be over his number. Last year, we sent a bill to the president that was vetoed. It's very hurtful and hard to take. So I don't know. Senator Harkin would like to get our bill to the floor. Probably for us, being on the floor is the best part of the whole procedure. It's like being in time warp. I see Donica and some other Hill staffers have been here. You know, you don't know what time it is. You can't use your BlackBerry. There's people watching to see if you use your BlackBerry. You're handling a number of different members who want to talk. You have new issues that come up about immigration, about emergency contraception, school vouchers. It's probably one of the most challenging and fascinating experiences you can go through. We get off the floor. We then move on to conference. This all should be done by September 30th, and to the frustration of David and Tom, it hasn't been in recent years. We then work out our differences with our real enemy, I mean, with the House, our colleagues in the House, and that is, again, a very intense 2 or 3 week period, culminated in a conference that can be very long, held in the bowels of the Capitol, in a room that doesn't have BlackBerry access. Next step is, in a year that would work, and believe me, no one more than the appropriators would like to get back to regular order. We'd send the bill to the president, it would be signed, it would be done by September 30th. The agencies could start their work. That hasn't happened in recent years. We had a bill that was vetoed last year. We end up in a continuing resolution, which causes problems for everybody. It doesn't reflect anyone's priorities, the administration's or Congress's. I'm sure it causes administrative issues for people like Tom. And we end up doing an omnibus bill, again, not the way to do work, where we put more than one appropriation bill together, negotiate with the White House, and it's finally signed. A good part of the fiscal year is over. It makes it difficult to administer. It doesn't really give us the time that we should have in the last quarter of the year to be doing site visits and to be really learning and to do the oversight we need to do our job well. It's just not the way to do things, but it's what happened, and I would not be surprised if it happens again this year. So that's sort of what it is. I feel very privileged to do what I do. It's great to work in the Senate. I love numbers, I love law, so we really enjoy it. But I think, like everyone on this panel, I'd love to see us get back to a regular process.
Thank you, Ellen. For those of you who don't know, the 302A number that she was talking about, this is a number that the chairman of the Appropriations Committee divides up with the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee and doles out. That's around $1 trillion. It's a massive sum of money. And if the Appropriations Committee does not finish its work, say, before the November election, there's $1 trillion on the table that needs to be dealt with pretty quickly for a new administration. You've got a lame duck administration, you've got a new administration, they've got $1 trillion left over, and then they've got another $1 trillion they got to put together. So that's a mere $2 trillion to deal with in a very short period of time. Tom Skelly, how do they do it?
They do a lot of juggling. Michael asked me to talk about budget in transition years, so I went back and looked at some of the more recent transition years. He didn't define that, so I did it on my own. I'll look at the transitions in which the president changed. And when we had an election year, which is similar to transition year, a lot of things happen in education budgets in the year of an election and the year following the election. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the changes that did occur, how it affects the timing of appropriations, how it affects our amount of appropriations, and again, some of those policies, which include things like a lot of things happen in the very first year of a president's administration, at least in education. And so we're all excited about what's going to happen during the next year because we're going to get a new president. We had the Reagan Block Grant in 1981. We had the Student Loan Reform Act, which created direct loans in 1993. We had No Child Left Behind. It basically worked out in 2001, all those things in the first year. So we are in our ready position during a transition year. Something's going to happen. We're looking forward to that as long-time career people. The timing of appropriations has certainly been affected. I went back and looked at some of the dates on when those things happened. I'll remind you, we've only had an appropriation by September 30th, the end of the fiscal year, 3 times in the last 20 years, for fiscal years 89, 95, and 97. So it doesn't usually happen for us. If it does happen, we figure something's going on with the body politic and trying to figure these things out. Jimmy Carter's last year in office was 1980. He didn't get an appropriation at all for the Department of Education that year. We didn't get our fiscal year 81 appropriation until June 5th of 1981. Hope that doesn't happen this year. President Herbert Walker Bush, the first one, we got the 1989 appropriation, the one that would be his last year. President Reagan's last year, his first 9/20/88, September 20, so finished in plenty of time. In the fiscal year 1993 appropriation, the last George Herbert Walker Bush year, Bill Clinton's first appropriation he was going to have to administer, was signed into law October 6th, 1992. So under Carter's last year, Bush's last year, they were on. Maybe they knew they were on the way out. The elections occurred after the appropriation got signed, but for whatever reason, the Congress and the President worked out an accommodation, had appropriation signed before the election. In 2001, for the 2001 appropriation, Bill Clinton's last year, the appropriation was signed December 21st of 2000. That was after the November election. So again, it might be that when you have changes in the party in power, you're going to have a delay in the appropriation. That's what it looked like to me from a very small sample size of only 4 cases. But things happened. The amount of the appropriation, the discretionary appropriation that Ellen deals with, in which Congress spends a lot of time on, has changed a lot. And sometimes you could go back and look at the appropriation for the last fiscal year for the president and then the first fiscal year of the new president. And I saw some interesting trends. In 1980, President Carter was extremely concerned about the size of the deficit, which was projected to grow to $60 billion that year. Seems like a joke when we've had deficits 8 times that high since, but very concerned. The appropriation, again, that was signed into law for us much later, still a year off, still provided less money than we had in the previous year. It was actually reduced $200 million, a couple of percent. The next year, 1982, when President Reagan was in office, our discretionary appropriation went down more, $600 million, over another 6%. So over the 2 years, something was going on. People knew that, in general, education money and I think other money was going down. At the time, the federal government provided about 6% of all the spending on elementary and secondary education. This year, I'll just skip ahead, we're at 8.9%. The federal government provides a lot more of the funds spent on elementary and secondary education, both in dollars and in percentage, than it did in 1980. But something was going on in the 1980 election. People were saying they wanted to cut things back, so the dollars went down. Fast forward to 92, the appropriations for 93 and 94, fiscal years 93 and 94 for education, it's interesting, went up about $1 billion first year, $1.5 billion the second. So they went up about 10% over 2 years. Again, something was saying, let's spend somehow some more money on education. That's how it got translated in the end. Not saying it was a direct relationship, but that was clearly the perception. 2000, again, closely contested elections, and I'm not making a lot of judgments, but our budget for 2001, the appropriation for 2001, went up $6.6 billion, and in 2002, the first President Bush year, it went up $7.7 billion. It's a total of about 40% increase in education funding appropriations over 2 fiscal years. We don't hear a lot about it, and we don't tend to put this on a lot of our charts either, because you had the last year of Clinton and the first year of Bush. Usually it's all Bush. What's the change since then? Well, we had a big shift in those years. A lot more money went into education. I think it said both parties were very concerned about the federal role in education, and there was a bump up. Again, there were reasons why. It's not just the appropriation, it's the programs for which that money is spent. Students do benefit in the end from federal appropriations for education, and they certainly have a cause. Going back to 81, first Reagan year, we had widespread use of something called reconciliation process. It's almost common to talk about it now. Back then it wasn't. It was one of the first years it was used. David Stockman, then OMB director, had been a congressman and took advantage of some of the rules, and they had widespread effect on education. We had 3 things I'll talk about briefly. We had consolidation of 48 programs into a block grant, relatively small programs, but many of them combined, and their funding reduced. It's a big shift from earlier years. We had, it was called Chapter 2. Chapter 1 was something that many of you probably recognize as Title I. It had been Title I since it got enacted in 1965 in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It continued being Title I until 81. It then became Chapter I. Not a lot changed, but the title, and somebody was concerned about that. Again, a few years later, we switched back to, I can't even remember when we switched back to Title I. In 1994, the Improving America Schools Act was passed, and we reverted back to Title I, so everybody was on the same page of their chapters.
Those
And that
budget
was
guys.
before secretary page. I should have saved that. Another thing it did was we changed student loans dramatically in 1981. Guaranteed student loans were widely available. There were efforts. There was laws passed in part of reconciliation that reduced student loan cost, increased fees, origination fees. There were some things, again, we didn't get a lot of signal of that happening under Carter, but again, Carter was concerned about the budget and cutting things back, so it wasn't too surprising that we had authorizations that did that. President Herbert Walker Bush took over in '89. In '88, appointed Laurel Cavazos as secretary. Transition wasn't bad, but again, in the first year, to make the point that things do happen in the first year of the president's term, we had the Governor's Summit on Education. It gathered governors for the first time, I think all but one or two, in Charlottesville, Virginia, to talk about education reform. Again, it set the stage for future years. Two of the governors in attendance, one was from South Carolina, Dick Riley, who later was Secretary of Education under President Clinton for 8 years, and the other was Governor Bill Clinton of Arkansas. He was there. So it set the stage for things to happen. In 1993, Bill Clinton's first year, the reconciliation vehicle again was used. We had the creation of the direct loan program, which allowed the government to make loans, not just to rely on the guaranteed student loan program. I don't know that a lot of this is all that scientific. Again, small sample size is just a flashback looking at the history, but it appears to me that something will happen on education in this next year. Don't know what that is. This is an unusual year. There's, as you know, for the election, there's no incumbent running or no vice president of the incumbent party. That's the first time since 1952. Pretty rare. There are some great benefits to that, to the budget office. We don't have to do a budget because there's no president. We don't have to submit the budget to Dave Rowe at OMB and tell him what we want. We'll wait for the next president and his Office of Management and Budget, which will largely be the same career people, but we'll wait for that process. Again, that gives us a little bit of free time this year to work on things that we put on our web page also. You know, Michael likes his page, and it's got a lot of information. So does ed.gov, the budget page, and has things on it also that they use, and I think source of a lot of their data. But it's good to have all of you thinking about education budgets. They are very important. They are important for students and schools. It's great to have kind of information that is available on these websites. It is real easy to use.
Thank you, Tom.
Compared to 40 years ago when I started.
Thank you, Tom. When I did education budget issues on Capitol Hill, I remember my boss, Senator Kennedy, used to pound on me, these numbers don't mean anything to people. 100 million, billion, 10 billion, you got to make it real. Bring it down to them, make it real. And so I'd say, okay, well, $1 billion, that's 200,000 kids going to state college for free every year. It's like, well, 200,000 doesn't mean enough to me. It's like, all right, well, imagine yourself in Fenway Park. There's like 40,000 seats there. Imagine that place sold out. That's 40,000. Now do that 5 times. Those are all the kids we'd be talking about sending to college for free. It's like, okay, I got that. I'd say, okay, well, that's good, but now give me this sort of the bigger picture here, because there's more going on than the fight over $1 billion versus $900 million. What's the bigger budget picture? And I was never very good at that, but there are tremendous larger pressures on the budget that determine the numbers that Dave Rowe and Ellen Murray and Tom Skelly end up putting together and bringing out, which impact kids. So I'm hoping Bob Greenstein, who, as I said, is sort of the founder of this field in many ways in Washington, can speak a little to these larger budget pressures that we face going forward.
Thank you, Michael. The larger budget pressures have a huge impact on the amount of money available for education now, and they will have a huger impact in coming decades. There are both short-term and long-term challenges here. I'll talk about the short-term first, which are easier, and then go to the long-term. So as Ellen noted, the level of funding for education, the level of funding her subcommittee gets to divvy up each year, is determined in significant part by the total amount of money made available through the budget process for non-defense non-security appropriations. Obviously, for appropriations as a whole at the first level, but then for the non-defense, non-security at a second level. And non-defense, non-security appropriations have been shrinking in real terms, in inflation-adjusted terms in recent years. Between fiscal '01 and fiscal '08, funding for domestic discretionary programs has been more constrained than any other part of the budget. It's shrunk both as a share of the budget and as a share of the economy. And I'm also going to separate here 2001 to 2002 and the period since 2002. In 2001, when Congress was writing the '02 appropriations bills, if you can remember this, Alan Greenspan was testifying on the Hill that he was worried that the budget surpluses were going to be too big. And Congress looked like it was awash in surpluses, and there were significant increases in appropriations enacted in the '02 bills. By '02, when Congress was writing the '03 bills, wham, deficits were back, and it was already pretty clear that this was not a temporary phenomenon. The world had changed, budget-wise. So in the 6-year period between fiscal '02 and fiscal '08, funding for domestic discretionary programs outside Homeland Security, this is the total amount for across all domestic discretionary outside Homeland Security, actually declined by 2.6% in real per capita terms. Now, let me just single out a few education or child-related areas. I don't have these figures in real per capita terms, I just have them in real terms, adjusted for inflation. If I had them in real per capita terms, that would mean that the percentage decline figures I'm about to give you would be bigger. So if you take the area of K through 12 education, vocational, and adult ed, the funding level that hit its peak in real terms in 2004. The '08 level is about 9% below the '04 level after adjusting for inflation. If you take Head Start and child care funding, they hit their peak in real terms in 2002. Head Start is now about 12% below the '02 level in real terms, child care about 19% below. Now, during this same period, there have been unusually large increases in defense funding. When I say that to people, their first reaction was, sure, Iraq. So we, in looking at this, divided defense funding into two categories. One is Iraq, Afghanistan, and what is called by the administration the global war on terror. And then you take the rest of the defense budget, the part that is unrelated to Iraq, Afghanistan, and the global war on terror, and you find that even the rest of the defense budget has risen quite rapidly, actually more rapidly over the last 6-7 years than Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, these things that you hear a lot about. The annual percentage growth rate has actually been higher. And it's the understanding of many analysts that over this period, the non-Iraq global war on terror part of the defense budget has not been subject to the same kind of scrutiny that the rest of the discretionary budget has. One little anecdote. I'm not going to name names here, but a senior Senate leadership aide told me the story of a meeting of senior staff of both parties and the White House within a week after 9/11. And in the meeting, they said to the White House, you tell us what you need to hit back on the terrorists. Whatever you need, you've got it. And this leadership person told me, some of us also said, now, we did think that the increase requested in, this would have been President Bush's first budget, for the Pentagon as a whole was too large. It had some things that really didn't make sense given the end of the Cold War. We want to work with you to go through that and distinguish the ones that are terror-related and the others. And, you know, we want to make some economies in the others. Everything you need for war on terror, you've got. And the response they had was, if that's what you want to do, be our guest. Let us be very candid with you. We'll say you're being unpatriotic and jeopardizing the security of the country. There was then a 10-second pause, and effectively, the people who'd been raising this said, we cave. Our members can't have you level those charges. It'd be politically disastrous. And since 9/11, there really has not been the same kind of scrutiny of the rest of the defense budget. Why do I raise this? Well, I don't know what the future holds in Iraq, but certainly, regardless of one's view of what should be done in the next 12 or 18 months, I'm sure we all hope that one way or another, over some not too many number of years, we need to do a lot less and spend a lot less there each year than we're currently spending. And it is my hope that if we can, as we move beyond, hopefully, the Iraq debate, that we can go back to having a more serious level of scrutiny of the rest of the Pentagon, and I think there are some significant economies there. In other words, what I'm saying is that part of the challenge is to try to see whether we can do some shifts within the discretionary, within the appropriation side of the budget. It's my view that we are now underfunding some not every, but some high priority areas of domestic discretionary. That would include those education programs that have a high bang for the buck and are effective, along with various other things, infrastructure, so forth. Hopefully, there can be some internal repositioning there. Now, that's sort of a quick capsule on, and there are many other things one could say, on the short-term picture. I want to jump to the long-term picture because it's by far the bigger challenge. Over the long term, I don't see how one can do the numbers and dispute the conclusion, and virtually no one I know does dispute the conclusion, that we face the most serious fiscal problems in the history of the Republic. Not this year, not 5 years from now, but you start getting out a couple of decades, and it is amazing. To just give you one little factoid, often repeated by us budget types, if you make the 01 and 03 tax cuts permanent, you continue the relief from the alternative minimum tax that Congress continues every year, and you don't really make any other changes, like in, health care, Social Security, whatever. You just run the numbers out. Within a couple of decades, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, defense, and interest payments on the debt consume more than 100% of all federal revenues. And as you go farther out, the amount by which they exceed 100% of federal revenues grows sharply. Now, in thinking about this, I tend to, Social Security is significant, but I'm going to move it to the side for a couple of reasons. First, it's actually significantly smaller than tax cuts or health care. Over the next 75 years, the period we usually use to look at Social Security's finances, the Social Security shortfall is less than 1/3 the cost of making the 01 and 03 tax cuts permanent. And the cost of making the tax cuts permanent, in turn, is substantially smaller than the projected increase in costs in Medicare and Medicaid. The big enchilada here is the rise in health care costs throughout the whole U.S. healthcare system. I didn't say the big enchilada is Medicare and Medicaid because these really big cost increases that are coming in Medicare and Medicaid are not driven primarily by the aging of the population. Yes, that's a factor, but the primary factor is the relentless increase in health care costs throughout the whole U.S. healthcare system. You can go back 30 years, and the annual rate of growth in health care costs per beneficiary in Medicare and Medicaid simply mirrors the annual rate of growth in healthcare costs system-wide. And this is really hard because some of that is coming from increases in medical technology that improve health and prolong life. And also, if you just tried to say, okay, we'll just greatly reduce projected cost increases in Medicare and Medicaid. Well, if you don't succeed in reducing the rate of growth in healthcare costs system-wide, you end up with huge disparities, a big two-tier healthcare system, which would not be politically sustainable. Medicaid already pays healthcare providers much less than either Medicare or the private sector does. The beneficiaries are poor. You can't really make them, pay lots more than they now do. They don't have the money. Got to be able to tackle healthcare costs system-wide, as well as doing some things in Medicare in particular. On the revenue side, as I noted, the cost of making the tax cuts permanent is more than triple the size of the Social Security surplus. The Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center has found that the average tax cut now, and they're still phasing in, average tax cut now for people over $1 million a year is $125,000 apiece per year. I think ultimately we're going to have to find a way to consider something like, I don't know, maybe a value-added tax to help pay for the increases in healthcare cost growth, because hopefully we'll be able to really slow those increases, but with advances in medicine, there will still be significant increases. Why am I talking about all of this? Because if we can't address this over the next several decades, then the rest of the budget, including education and many other things, increasingly gets squeezed out very gradually, over a long period of time. But the numbers are really bad here. Current indications, not good right now. Highly ideological, not just partisan, but highly ideological budgetary atmosphere. For example, Congress has an expert bipartisan commission on how we pay providers, healthcare providers in Medicare, the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission. It is found that private insurance companies that are in Medicare are being paid 13% more on average than it costs to treat the same people in regular Medicare. It unanimously recommended that Congress phase out these overpayments and pay the private companies the same amount, saves $150 billion over 10 years. The White House has said that if any reduction whatsoever is made in these overpayments, it'll veto any bill it's in, regardless of the rest of the content of the bill. Tax cuts. We're having a debate right now over what we call the extenders. These are 20, forget the number, 20-some, mostly 60, mostly business, not entirely, tax cuts that are always extended a year or two at a time. And under the pay-as-you-go rules, we ought to pay for extending them. And over 40 members of the Senate have signed a letter saying they will filibuster any bill that pays for any of the extenders. That is a matter of principle. Once a tax cut is in the code, it should never have to be paid for. Well, if that's the policy, then if you're a member of the Finance or Ways and Means Committee and you have a special interest that wants a new tax cut, just get it in for 1 year, and under this principle, it should be extended every year for free. And the more we do these things, the more we squeeze the rest of the budget. Now, one last point. It would be a mistake to say, gee, everything depends on the decision, everything for education depends on the decisions made elsewhere. Obviously, also very important are the findings on how effective are education dollars in various programs. What works and what doesn't. And that should be a factor in the level of money here. To the degree that the findings are clear and the policymakers understand them, that certain kinds of educational investments are really good returns for the taxpayer, I think the case is stronger and more dollars come into the education area. Now, I'm not Pollyannish. I think there are a number of parts of the budget where you could do great research, and if you could show something was effective, it would not necessarily mean that it gets any more money. But education is so popular, the public is so interested in it, that this is an area where I think, to the degree that one can find and identify the things that are most effective and direct resources to those, the total pie will be larger than if we don't do that kind of analysis and bring it to play in the policy arena. So the conclusion from all of this is policymakers need help, both in connection with how to sort out these larger budget priorities and where education fits within them, and within education on what are the soundest investments, what are the best use of the resources. And this is an area in which, when think tanks do their work well, they can play an important role. Frankly, that's why I'm glad to be here today at the launching of this new education budget think tank, because there's a really important role to play in this area in the challenging budget priorities debates in the years and decades ahead.
Thank you, Bob, and I asked him to do that shameless plug on our behalf, but I appreciate it. I think he made two key points that I want to just highlight. One is, you may have noticed that Bob often spoke in inflation-adjusted terms, whereas often when you speak to appropriators, or I should say appropriators, budgeteers, in the administration, and for that matter even outside, they don't speak in inflation-adjusted terms, and that makes a real-world difference when it comes to schools, families, kids. The same holds with these timing issues that we've been discussing, because when a budget's delayed, it's delayed to a point where the school year may be beginning. Like Tom Scully mentioned, I think it was the budget in 1989, fiscal year 1989, passing in June of 1989. Well, the school year budget was for 1989-1990 was put together before June 1989. So money was made available, and yet the people who were trying to put together budgets at the local level didn't know how much money was there to be had, and so they may not have made the best use of it when it did finally become available. And then I said 2 points. There's the last thing I wanted to mention about Bob. He's talking about this bigger picture and these bigger numbers. It's important to keep in mind these bigger pictures, bigger numbers, as they relate to education in particular. He talked about the increase in defense spending, separate from the war on terror, separate from the Iraq War and so forth, of being about 10%. That's about $50 billion or so, Department of Defense budget. That's almost the size of the Department of Education's budget, entire. So the growth in defense is like adding another Department of Education, doubling it in size year after year. I'm going to turn to a Q&A. I want to ask one question of the panel, and we'll see whoever wants to try and take a stab at it. Each year, programs that serve low-income kids or families tend to be pitted against one another in the process, at least as far as the public decision-making process goes. Be it on the discretionary side or the discretionary side without consideration of the mandatory side. How could the process be altered in some way to diminish the likelihood that we continue to have to make these difficult decisions of, are we going to fund Pell Grants or the Center for Disease Control? Or are we going to cut funding for student loans or cut funding for I don't know, food stamps. How do we get out of this vice grip that low-income folks, or at least their interests, seem to be in when it comes to the legislative process? Anyone? Bueller?
I don't know how we get out of it, but let me slightly modify your question.
Please. I'm sure you'll do a better job.
It seems to me that this is not, I don't know that there's a big competition budget-wide among programs for low-income kids. I think there's a huge competition in the labor age bill, and that's where it really falls. I mean, a little example, a program I've long been very interested in, I think it's one of the most effective programs in the budget, is the WIC program, the Women, Infants, and Children Nutrition Program. And there is research showing huge effectiveness. That's clearly a part of this story. But also a part of the story is that it's in the ag appropriations budget, and there really aren't any other large, low-income or other social-type programs in the ag appropriations bill. So if you kind of track the trajectory of WIC, which started as a $20 million a year pilot project in '74, and Head Start, another low-income kids program in which there's been a lot of interest. Today, people in the audience know the percentage. I won't. Head Start only serves X% of the eligible kids. It's a minority. I don't remember what the percentage is, right? WIC, since 1997, has served all of the eligible kids who apply each year. And it's not an entitlement, it's a discretionary program. It's now about a $6 billion a year annual program. And the money has been able to be found for it in part because there is not that kind of competition within the ag appropriations bill. So to me, your question is really one on the structure of the appropriations bills, and I don't know the answer, because as long as we have a limit on overall appropriations, which you have to have, and you then divide it up and you have a limit for each bill, and you have so many of these key social programs all in one bill, the Labor HHS education bill. I don't know how you get out of that bind.
I really don't either. It's interesting about WIC. I think one advantage WIC has is it has served 100% of eligible persons, even though it's not entitlement.
Right.
So there is a big pressure to maintain that, just as we have a pressure to maintain Pell funding.
Exactly.
Head Start has never gotten close to serving 100% of eligible kids. So it may be, I know talking to my ag counterparts, they're feeling tremendous pressure to maintain WIC funding to serve all eligibles. We feel tremendous pressure to maintain Pell funding. So it may be more that once a program starts to serve everyone, it becomes like an entitlement, even though the pressure's put on the discretionary. I think your comments about defense, Bob, I find fascinating. I was talking to some people about the same thing yesterday. We really have been hurt in this environment with the pressure people feel that if they don't fully fund any request for Homeland Security or DOD, that you somehow are on the side of the terrorist. And there is...
You open yourself up to an attack at it.
There's less and less money to divide between the other subcommittees. And while Ag is able to keep up WIC, they tell me, they've had a hard time. For instance, FDA just came out is underfunded. And so they're competing with FDA versus WIC. I think it's the entire domestic discretionary pot that we have to look at, and also convince people that it's not what's causing the budget deficit. It's, as you said, the tax increases, it's Medicare, Social Security.
I think, just one point to add to that. One of the main causes is jurisdictional. there's not necessarily a logical reason why, NIH and, the Job Corps and, the student, the Pell Grant program should be the ones competing with each other for a finite number of resources as opposed to different allocation. One of the ways, one potential means beyond that, and there's been a few places where that's happened and several where it hasn't, is to look beyond jurisdictional issues. On Pell Grants, some of the legislation that paid for some of the Pell Grant program on the mandatory side and offset those costs relieves some of the pressure on the appropriations end to pay for Pell Grant costs. There's other jurisdictional issues. Just one example, there's a proposal where if you changed in the tax code, where you would allow, matching between students' 1040s and students' FAFSAs. The Department of Education has done runs basically or analysis showing you could reduce Pell Grant error by a couple $100 million. It would help on the appropriations end. But it's not something that, the proposal is within the jurisdiction of the tax committees, and that's not a place where they sort of see they don't have the financial incentive to do that. So I guess to the degree that there's more, opportunity to sort of get beyond sort of the jurisdictional looking at issues, the more opportunity there is to, have broader policy choices.
So political turf. Do we have questions in the audience? Sure.
If you talk to employers...
I'm sorry, can you please give your name and affiliation, all
Pete
questions?
Davis, Davis Capital Investment Ideas. If you talk to employers, they're very concerned about being able to get an educated, skilled workforce. There's a huge amount of pressure on H-1B visas, and a lot of these jobs are just done overseas. And I understand that you can't bring the estimates of that productivity forward into the budget process. It's all built into the baseline anyways. But we're killing ourselves by not funding these education investments. So how do you fold that into the process?
Well, unfortunately, and the way we do budgeting, you don't get credit
Exactly.
for investing in people. I think we've seen studies where investing in Head Start is going to save cost in later years. Obviously, investing in kids today is going to make a stronger economy later. Investing in some of the preventive health programs but outside the window, and we don't get credit for that. We get a few times we get credit for fraud and abuse type activities. So Medicare fraud, Social Security. It's a hard issue, but I think we are missing the boat by not investing, and we're going to pay for it later because we're facing these Social Security and Medicare issues.
One point. It's a little tangential, but I do think it's an important one. I think there's a risk of, in some parts of the country, in some significant disinvestment in education in the next couple of years, resulting not from directly from federal budgetary decisions, but from what's happening in the housing market. And with the decline in home values, there are various jurisdictions that are particularly, there's often a lag in home valuations and property tax revenues. But, we're looking over a couple of years in some jurisdictions at substantial reductions in property tax revenue that has significant implications for state and local education finance. It's one of the reasons why, we at the center believe that if there is going to be, as there may or may not be, another economic stimulus package, that one of the core elements ought to be some fiscal relief for state governments, and perhaps with some mechanisms to make sure some of that gets through to local governments dealing with these property tax problems. I was a little disturbed that on the way over this morning, I read a CQ or Congress Daily or one of the articles with some discussion about a possible second stimulus bill next month, and it mentioned, the thing, employment insurance, infrastructure, didn't mention fiscal relief. But I am quite concerned. This is not permanent. This is, temporary. But for the next few years, I'm quite concerned about impacts on state and local education finance from the fallout of the bursting of the housing bubble.
I think you're absolutely right, Bob. And that may take a little time. There may be a little bit of a time lag, but it's coming. It seems to me this begs the question of capital budgeting, which there was some interest in the early Clinton years. I don't know if anyone in our panel is familiar with capital budgeting or willing to speak to it. Could we have a capital budget? And if so, what would the implications be for education?
Most budgeteers, many budgeteers, like the idea of a capital budget in the abstract, but oppose it in practicality because we tend to believe it would be very difficult to prevent all sorts of things from, as a result of major lobbying efforts, getting the capital label. You also have all sorts of questions as to defense procurement and all kinds of other things. And for these reasons, regardless of party, budget committees tend to be opposed to the idea. So I don't think it's likely. In concept, it sounds great. When you try and figure out how to actually make it work in the real world of congressional politics, it's very hard to figure it out.
Yeah, I would agree. We're having enough trouble getting our job done now. In concept, it makes a lot of sense, but you then will be dealing with people lobbying, as Bob said, and not being very clear to the public, and we could come out, I think, with some skewed results. But the concept is a good one.
Fair enough. Questions? Ms. Sarah Watson.
Sarah Watson with the Pew Charitable Trust. Following up on the discussion, okay, if you could maybe not wave a magic wand, but make some feasible changes to the budget process to get the information about the long-term returns of certain investments into the calculation, what would those be?
To repeat the old adage, in my view, this is an issue we talk a lot about in our office, and I have some strong views about, not universally shared in town. But I'm very much in the camp that the process is not the problem is the problem. On most occasions when we've attempted to deal with the problem by changing the process, we've gotten failure. The lead example of that was the Graham-Rudman-Hollings law in the 80s. People sometimes cite the pay-as-you-go rules and the discretionary caps in the 90s. Those did not force any deficit reduction. They enforced an agreement that had already been made by Congress. And if you can't get agreement among the president and the leaders of both parties to do the heavy lifting, I think trying to force it through the process doesn't work. If they don't agree, they'll find a way to evade the process. So sort of the question then is, and nothing's going to happen in the current polarized atmosphere until after the election, but regardless of who wins the presidency, there's kind of a question of how could I'd prefer not to see a process change, not to see some commission, but how do we actually get the leaders to sit down and start negotiating with each other on the issues themselves? system-wide healthcare reform, MedPAC recommendations. What are we going to do about all the tax cuts that expire at the end of 2010? And if you think of where big things have happened, the 83 on Social Security, the 90 bipartisan budget agreement, it starts with the president showing leadership and reaching across the party line. And so I think the first, whoever wins, whether it's McCain or Obama, do they go out early on? Are they willing to move a little from their promises? Big new tax cuts, particularly McCain, certain spending programs, Obama. Not that you have to abandon all those, I don't think you can do all of them. But are they willing to give equal billing? Kind of like Bill Clinton did when he came in '93. He didn't campaign in '92 on a big deficit reduction platform. He came in '93. Didn't end up being bipartisan, but, he put on the table the importance of moving on some of these other issues that are necessary to create room in the budget. I also think that a lot of Democrats, Republicans as well, draw the lesson from '93, since the Democrats lost Congress in '94. I think there were other factors that were a lot more important. But the lesson that's drawn is you do the heavy lifts just in one party, the other party will cream you. So the question is, whoever wins the presidential election, will they fairly early on elevate the need to start dealing with these longer-term problems, reach across the aisle, bring in the leaders of both parties, and will the leaders of both parties on the Hill be receptive? Will they be willing, if you move on your favorite thing, I'll move on mine. I don't know, but yeah, it has to start with the president. If it doesn't start with the president, you don't get to first base.
We're in a situation now where we're doing absolutely the opposite. Given the president's budget, Senator McConnell couldn't pass a Labor H bill that would get 51 votes. I mean, we're not negotiating. We're really not working together. We're not making any movement. If anything, it's been one of the worst years, I think, as far as bipartisan cooperation, or at least between the executive branch and the legislation. So I couldn't agree more with what you said.
Tom Skelly, you've been in the administration for 30 years. You sort of grand bargain. Seems like it sometimes takes some time for the parties to come together. And Bob mentioned 1983 and again in 1990. This was not a transition year per se. How long do you think it takes for the confidence-building measures that might be necessary to have this type of grand bargain that could solve some of these bigger problems? Or is it, or are we wrong, am I wrong, the premise of my question wrong, in that it's better to do in a honeymoon period with a robust majority as was done in 1993?
Yeah, again, my view, just from the evidence in education, but also going back to, Franklin Roosevelt, you get everything done in that first year. If you don't, forget it. That's my
succinctly put. Any other questions? In front.
Hi, my name is Clint Ganello. I'm an intern at Senator Kennedy's Education Policy Office. I've been involved up in Massachusetts. I mean, I know we shouldn't compare state and federal governments, but at the State House for our fiscal year 09 budget, there was an amendment which unfortunately failed, which they tried to use. I mean, I know it's kind of a curse word here in Washington, but they tried to get an earmark into the budget for education, mostly financial aid, our Max Grant, which is the main income-based financial aid. Has there been any talk about that, or, I mean, would it even be possible to get anything going on that?
I want to, before our panelists begin to answer, this is our final question, so try and answer the question and make any conclusory remarks if you want as well. Remarks as well. Anyone?
I mean, I think that, I guess on a couple different issues, on financial and student aid generally, a few different pieces. One, there were fairly significant increases in grant aid and student aid provided last year in legislation that Congress passed, based in part off of the president's budget. It was the College Cost Reduction and Access Act, which is going to be leading to fairly large Pell Grant increases. And as the panel has talked about, if you're looking at sort of dollar investments in grant aid for students, it's there's what, about a $2 billion or so increase in Pell Grant funding this year.
The maximum grant's up about 10%
Yeah.
this year. The kids are getting Pell Grants to start school in July, are getting can get a maximum of 10% more than they did last year, just in Pell Grants. They can also, a law passed 2 years ago, get money if they have a high grade point average, or if they major in math and science, they can get another $750 as freshmen. They can get up to $4,000 as juniors and seniors. There is more financial aid available for college students from the federal government than there has been in years. I mean, don't just believe, some headline you read in the paper. There's more money there. It's not maybe as much as you like, but it's a lot more for almost 6 million students.
Yeah, I mean, the tough question and the trigger is whether the increases in federal student aid are at the same pace as the increases in college costs. And I know that and it depends, looking from institution to institution, sort of what those inflation rates look like.
I didn't expect I was going to make any comments on education policy as distinguished from the budget as a whole, but I really want you on this issue. And I think your comment at the end was the key. We took some looking at this. If you simply are looking at, year 1, year 2, year 3, there was a significant Pell Grant increase passed. However, you're going to know it, everybody on the panel but me, I'm forgetting the name of the precise survey that has data on aid and unmet need and, move the independent students out to the side because there are all these issues there. Just looking at the dependent students, there's still substantial unmet need for low-income students. And college tuitions increase so much, just looking at community colleges and four-year public universities, that it's my understanding that the increases in the Pell Grants simply take you back to the aid. I'm not disputing the 10%, but because it fell for several years in relation to tuition costs, I think it simply takes you back as a percentage of cost to where we were maybe around 2003, 2004, still significant unmet need. Now, where I'm heading with this comment is ideally, further simplifications could be done in Pell's, further aid. But in fact, since we're discussing how the budget gets put together, there's this other player here, and it's the tax writing committees that have, over the last 10 or 15 years, greatly expanded tax expenditures for tax breaks for costs for upper middle, and upper income families through the tax code. And everything we're hearing are that the tax committees want to do further expansions next year in higher education tax credits. And the question it raises for me, I can make an argument that, look, instead of doing that, let's go through, but you don't have access to their money.
Right.
So if, you can debate whether this is the right place to put the next dollar, but if the tax writing committees are going to increase the costs of the higher education tax credits, it seems to me we ought to make those credits at least partially refundable. We ought to cover more costs, like kids in community college have other costs but lower tuition. Certainly, wouldn't that be better than extending who gets the credits up to $180,000 or $200,000 a year? That wouldn't make sense to me. So again, I'm not talking about this in relation to Pell's, but just within the world of the tax committees and the decisions they will make on education tax credits, I think in 2009 there'll be some really important decisions made, and I'm worried that they won't be the most sensible uses of the new dollars.
I couldn't agree more. On that fine word, we're going to close our event. Thank you all for coming. Go to edbudgetproject.org. Thank you for the panel.